The Parsons Housing Justice Lab is a platform for dialogue, research, and strategic design that advocates for equitable neighborhood development. It brings together students, faculty, researchers, activists, community-based organizations, housing experts, and local politicians committed to housing justice and community-driven development across cities. Combining academic and popular knowledge, this collaborative laboratory aims to expose damaging aspects produced by the current housing system, such as discrimination, tenure, insecurity, displacement, and homelessness, as well as exploring practices of policy frameworks emerging from as in a response that pursues housing justice through the promotion of tenant protections and rent regulations, new forms of access to adequate housing, capacity building for collective action, cooperative models of housing and community development, and social alternatives for housing and equitable development. Through programs, this laboratory seeks to amplify the efforts of communities, housing coalitions, urban movements, policy platforms promoting housing justice. Building on the exchange of current experiences and emerging practices, the ultimate goal of this platform is to facilitate university-community partnerships to produce new knowledge, methodologies, instruments, and to advance local efforts bringing about social change and spatial justice. I love the line where we articulate connecting people to social issues within the community. Many of my current students are in the room, and they will tell you we do field trips, and I think they enjoy those field trips, to go out and meet community members and understand the struggles that they're pushing back against and what students in this program can do to support their struggles. The Master of Science in Design and Urban Ecologies is a program that radically reframes the study of urbanization and cities through design-led justice-centered approaches to urban transformation. By combining urbanism with ecology, design, policy, and activism, students gain expertise needed to address global urban challenges and opportunities. In line with the new school's commitment to environmental and social justice, students from diverse backgrounds work closely with external partners to design and implement proposals for critical change. This event was organized by the New York Human Right to Housing campaign. I am a member of that campaign. There are other members in the room. We are supported by the National Homeless Law Center out of DC. I work closely with Sia Hedge, who is sitting here up front with me. Sia and I help facilitate that group in New York. And I would like to thank our co-sponsors of the program, the American Civil Liberties Union and their Human Right to Housing Project. Jamil Dakwa is in the room. Jamil, raise your hand. Jamil is somebody I've worked with since going back to 2010. And I just reminisce with some of the folks that Jamil and the folks from the Law Center in 2010, they took me as an activist to Geneva to have conversations with other countries around the world about how homelessness is playing out in the US. And it was very powerful for me as an organizer and an activist to be able to articulate to other countries of the world. And it wasn't them speaking for me. They pushed me out front and said, there is the representative for Iran. Go tell them about homelessness in the US. We're over here if you need us. And it was very powerful and moving for somebody like me who had just come out of homelessness to be able to bring my voice globally to impact what is happening around the world. In June 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision in the Johnson versus Grants Pass case. The result of this decision allowed cities and municipalities to fine and jail people with no alternatives but to sleep rough or sleep in the streets and other areas deemed unfit for human habitability. This past June 3rd, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing and the staff in Geneva facilitated a meeting with people with lived experience of homelessness, advocates, activists, and organizers from across the U.S. to hear directly how the criminalization of homelessness is playing out across the country. So you might ask me, what is a special rapporteur? I get that question all the time. Like, people always, Rob, a special what? A special rapper what? Yeah. So a special rapporteur are independent human rights experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council to monitor, advise, and report on human rights situations in specific countries on thematic issues like violence against women, arbitrary detention, extreme poverty, water and sanitation, to name a few. But there are others included in those different mandates. So we are here this evening to hear from the current UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, and he is here, he's we're fortunate enough to get him a day before he delivers his thematic report to the UN General Assembly. So for me, it's a sense of pride to be able to stand up here and say that, right? Before the UN gets to hear from the UN Special Rapporteur, civil society gets to understand what he has seen and what he's going to report to the UN General Assembly. So that puts us in a powerful position. What I want people to take away from this conversation is, and I'm going to say this very clearly, the UN as a whole isn't something that's going to change the way we live, but these are mechanisms within the UN that can support the work that we're doing on the ground. And we have to learn how to embrace and build a relationship with those different mechanisms. So besides rapporteurs, there are working groups. There's, I think right now, the working group of people of African descent, the working group on corporate accountability. We have to embrace these mechanisms and use them to our advantage. So with that, I want to introduce the current UN Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, and I'll just give a little history. The very first was Maloon Kathari, who was served 2 terms. I never got to work directly with Maloon Kathari. I was going through homelessness while Maloon was serving his term as rapporteur, but Maloon and I are not strangers to one another. Every time he's in New York, he reaches out to me, and we sit down, we have coffee, we have conversation. After Maloon, there was Raquel Ronick. Some of you may know that Raquel Ronick came to the U.S. on an official mission in October of 2009. Another very powerful situation. She visited 7 cities in the U.S. and issued a report with 108 recommendations to our local and federal government. She was followed by Leilani Farhar, who is from Canada. Leilani and I formed a very special relationship working together. And one of my proudest moments with Leilani was bringing her to Brook Park in the Bronx during a high-level political forum in the summer of 2018, and watching the expressions on people's faces when I said, that's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, in shorts, a tied-off t-shirt, and the people were like staring at me like, yo, what's up with that? And then we had a bunch of civil society from across the globe sitting in Brook Park in the Bronx, so pretty powerful. So that lands us today with the current UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. He is a professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A lawyer by training, Rajagopal is an expert in many areas of human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, the UN system, and human rights challenges imposed by development activities. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Rob Robinson has been such a stellar friend of the entire UN Housing Mandate Office. He's one of the few people that we can always rely on to support our work. And so I came in with certainly introductions from previous rapporteurs who said, well, if you're in the US, there are a few people that you can count on for the work and can learn from about the situation, really, concerning housing and homelessness and other issues. And Rob's name was top of the list. So I'm really glad to be here, and very grateful to Rob and to the New School for enabling this. It's a very important gathering, and I'm also very grateful to the panelists who are assembled here, and I look forward to listening and learning also. It's yet another opportunity to interact with civil society groups and others with lived experience of not homelessness in this case, but generally regarding housing conditions. And that's one of the many ways in which, as UN Special Rapporteurs, we learn about the real work. So that the work we do and the recommendations we make and the reports we write are informed by real life issues. They're not academic exercises at all, although I'm an academic. I should also perhaps spend a few minutes just explaining what rapporteurs are, or as Rob said, you want to rap what? And I was joking with him that maybe we should rename ourselves rappers instead of rapporteurs. He'll give us some street cred maybe, but whatever it is, rapporteurs, I just want to say a few sort of brief words about the UN human rights system and the role of the rapporteurs in it. Human rights, as you know, is one of the founding sort of ideas behind the UN Charter. It was drafted in San Francisco and essentially came together in 1945. And when human rights was mentioned as a framework, the idea was that collectively all countries owe a responsibility to each other to make sure that they all comply with the need to respect human rights. Because it was clearly recognized after World War II that when societies ignore human rights and they violate human rights with impunity, it surely leads to war. In fact, the huge violations of human rights before the war were seen as the main reason why war took, happened in the first place. So human rights has long been part of the UN system. The institutions that we have through the UN that are endowed with the responsibility to promote human rights come from this angle. So the main institution right now that exists for promoting and protecting human rights is the UN Human Rights Council. It's an intergovernmental body of 54 nation states that assembles in Geneva. There is no space to assemble more states here, so in New York City. But this body is a political body. The members get elected. Yes, members have to run in elections, and member states can lose elections. Russia, for example, has lost election twice, just to give you an example. So there is a minimum level of credibility that is expected. And when countries think that it will be politically difficult for them to win, they also decide not to run. So the US, for example, decided not to run last year because they knew that it might get complicated to get elected to a human rights body at this time. And the UN Human Rights Council has a number of basically, of course there is a small bureaucracy, a staff that administers the system and supports experts like myself who are relied on for actually doing the meat of the work. But none of us are paid. We are volunteers, basically. We have a regular job. I'm a professor at MIT. Most are academics. We have to be independent. We cannot be government servants or judges or others. And we basically do the work pro bono, and we rely on civil society groups like yourselves and others who facilitate visits, like some of the visits that you guys mentioning, Rob was mentioning earlier, including, I believe, a visit by Leilani to Detroit.
Leilani and Katerina de Albuquerque, the Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation, we brought them to Detroit and Flint in 2014.
Oh, wow.
That was just in the light of the crisis then in Flint. So it can be special rapporteurs are officers with almost no resources, but the global support and the civil society support that they have is so solid that virtually in every country there is a strong network of support wherever we go. And that's been true of my experience. The rapporteurs are appointed for about for 2 terms, 3 + 3, 6 years. I'm in my last year, the 6th year. And so as part of the work, we do 3 things. First is we submit 2 reports per year, 1 report to the UN General Assembly in the fall, another report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva in the spring. These reports are on themes, major issues, like one of my reports was on the global affordability crisis, which I will mention soon. Or the report that we are discussing today, the Breaking the Cycle report last year on the need to decriminalize homelessness. And this report that I'm presenting tomorrow is on the crucial connections between land and adequate housing. So these are basically themes on which we submit reports. So there are 2 reports per year. And then we have this thing called country visits. These are official visits formally negotiated and agreed on with countries. So the visit that was done by Raquel Rolnick to the United States was one such visit. So these are formal affairs. States formally receive us. You meet at a very high level, often with the with the heads of state and with senior officials, and you have complete right to move around the country, meet who you wish, and basically have access to all the information that you need to draw up a report assessing how the country is doing with regard to, in my case, the right to adequate housing. I've done some country visits. My most recent one was to Guatemala in August. The report is actually getting written right now. And then the third thing we do is receive complaints from affected groups and communities who suffer violations of housing rights. So a lot of cases involving forced evictions, as you can imagine, or failure to resettle after evictions. A lot of cases involving discrimination complaints. A lot of cases also involving specific impacts on vulnerable groups, indigenous people or others. And quite a lot of cases now piling up on the use of criminal law against homeless persons and other issues. So these are like urgent complaints. Usually people are complaining because they have run out of options. There is no other place they can complain to. Their own states and courts are not possible as avenues. They reach out to the UN to see what they can do. There is not much directly we can do in the sense of ordering, authorities or whatever. Every state is sovereign, but often there may be opportunities to intervene in ways that can buy a lot of time, delay things, or to open the door for alternative approaches. And I've been able to succeed on quite a lot of those, in fact. So my most recent, I'll mention only one example. My most recent successful case has been an intervention in Indonesia involving an attempted eviction of almost 19,000 indigenous people. Very, very critical issue. The whole project was funded as an ecotourism project by the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is this China-dominated, development bank, as an alternative to the World Bank that has been in existence for a few years. It's a major source of financier of large projects. And so the groups there approached me, and my intervention, which can consist of both an official intervention, such as the one I sent this year on the cuts to budgets in the United States, and the complete destruction of whatever housing infrastructure had been built up at the federal level, including the disbanding of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. I communicated about that, so that's an official communication, which stays on the record. The countries concerned have an opportunity and actually an obligation to respond. Many don't, but many do as well. The best part is that both the letter and the communication are public, will become public. There's a 60-day confidentiality period. So you can look at all of them and see if the letters and the answers make any sense. So it's a very transparent process. And it's an important accountability mechanism in a world without much accountability and transparency.
That's right.
So it's used constantly by civil society groups. In fact, the work is overwhelming. I have 2 staff, and we have to be very strategic in what is it that we can respond to, and because complaints come in every week from around the world, because it's a global mandate, it's not one country. We're talking about 194 states. At any given moment, you could get complaints from 20, 30 states. So it's a real challenge. That, I guess, is what I could say. Perhaps I've spent too long already talking about rapporteurs, but maybe very briefly, some remarks about the 2 critical reports. First, mainly about the Breaking the Cycle report on decriminalization of homelessness that I did with the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty last year. So in that report, basically, when we put out a call for inputs and invited inputs from civil society groups, experts, local governments, federal governments, etc., to provide information, analysis, views on it, it was overwhelming. We had more than 130 submissions from around the world, and I'm not talking about 1 or 2 pages. These are detailed submissions with data analysis, legal and other technical analysis. It took us a lot of time to absorb. And so that's one of the unique things about these reports also. They're not just academic exercises or expert views. They're based on actually grassroots experience that's flowing up to us. And we rely on them to produce the knowledge that actually results in the language in the report. In fact, there is no other UN report that has a kind of a grassroots methodology like that. So it's a very unique process. And one of my most rewarding experiences as a rapporteur has been the ability to absorb these kinds of grassroots knowledge and then to write these reports. So in that report, what do we say? We say, well, criminalization basically violates human rights massively, and it doesn't work for a number of other reasons as well. That's, if you want to respond to homelessness, there are some good ways of doing it, and there are some terrible ways of responding. The top of the list in terms of what is a terrible way to respond is criminalization. And we really sort of show with examples from around the world how these are legacies of colonialism, for example, very often. To give you an example, in most of the post-colonial states, they never criminalized people who didn't have homes. Homelessness, of course, has been with us basically as a result of either poverty, people who are unable to afford their own homes, or as a result of misfortune. People may be hit by a storm, a flood, or something that destroys whatever humble home that they had, then they become homeless, or because of war. Conflict comes your way, an army conducts a blitzkrieg through your town, everything is burned down, and you're homeless. Right now, it's exactly the dynamics behind homelessness. What are the drivers of homelessness? Well, the Secretary General's most recent report on homelessness says it clearly. It's conflict, it's climate change, and most importantly now, the lack of affordable housing and the inability of people living in homes to continue to live there. They get evicted far too easily, they get no alternatives, and when they end up on the street, they become homeless, or they are inadequately living, which is a form of hidden homelessness that in fact data gathering by governments doesn't even capture, because there are so many conflicting definitions of homelessness now between states. There is no common agreed upon definition of the UN. That's one of the issues before us, in fact. So these are serious drivers of homelessness because people lose homes for a variety of reasons, and we have to recognize all of them, including, as I said, conflict now. We see that in Gaza, for example, in just less than 2 years, 2 million people have become homeless, just like that. You know, should we not count them as homeless? And they are counted as homeless globally, and in the UN Secretary General's report, conflict is recognized as a driver. Now, I should also mention that there has been resolutions on homelessness at the General Assembly in the last 4 years. It's a biennial resolution, and there have been 2 resolutions. The 3rd resolution is coming up during this session, and I'm trying to negotiate with a group of states, mainly led by African states, to try to make sure that the language in the resolution really captures the reality of what produces homelessness, what works to deal with homelessness, and what states should avoid, including criminalization. We'll see how far we succeed in getting states to agree on putting this language in. So on this report, what we did was we analyzed the reasons why criminalization of homelessness is a terrible approach. It just doesn't work, it's too costly, and in a variety of other ways, they violate human rights. And not just right to housing, but we also pointed out, as we did in our amicus brief that we filed at the Supreme Court last year in the Grants Pass case, with the great help from Eric Tars here and Tamara, right, from Florida. So in that, we mainly pointed out that, you know, in many circumstances, because the focus was on the 8th Amendment in that case, that in fact, you know, criminalizing people who don't have any other options to exercise their biological functions, like sleep, could be considered as a form of torture or cruel and inhuman treatment under international law. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decision went the other way, and we are seeing the consequences of too many jurisdictions in the United States resorting to criminal law, and very, very concerned about it. It's on top of my mind, and I'm really eagerly looking forward to jurisdictions in the US that will buck the trend and that will do something different. Hopefully, we'll see good number of examples of that. I will conclude by just saying that the report that I'm presenting tomorrow is on land and adequate housing. I mean, it's crystal clear that, well, all housing has to be located on land. They are based on terra firma, they're not built on thin air. But land, it turns out, is a very ignored aspect of housing. Not just among states or among international organizations, but this may be a difficult message, but even among civil society groups that are typically working on housing. Housing rights groups haven't taken land as seriously as they should have over the years. That's my very friendly message to you. I think it's high time that that is actually changed for a variety of reasons. One is that if affordable housing is seen as a response to, say, respond to homelessness, and also to, in fact, prevent homelessness so that people can find homes that they can afford to live in. Affordable housing is so, finding countries around the world, particularly in the global north, are finding it so difficult to build affordable housing because of a variety of reasons, but one of them is the expense and the market for it. And one of the reasons why affordable housing at scale cannot be built that easily, that also meets the expectations of market actors, is because of the cost of inputs. The main cost of the input in affordable housing is, in fact, land, service land. I did a report on global affordable housing crisis in which I estimated that between 50 to 70% of inputs into building new housing in rich country markets comes from service land. Land is incredibly expensive. It doesn't come from the cost of materials or even labor. Especially, in fact, if you move away to European countries where modular housing is more common, cost of construction goes down quite significantly. The real issue has to come with land. And land is basically governed according to these incredibly expansionist logics. There are two logics at play. The first logic is largely in the rich countries, like the United States, where there is this inflated idea of private property and home ownership. That, first of all, home ownership is the only way to live, to have access to housing. And secondly, that home ownership, has to rest on this exclusive notion of private property. It's like the 15th century notion of some medieval, kings saying, this is my territory, that's your territory. And then put a notice that says, no trespass. And so, unfortunately, this idea of private property is not fit for modern times. It has not been fit for almost, I would say, forever. But there are not enough adequate alternative models that are explored. I visited San Diego on the invitation of local civil society groups who wanted me to look at this incredible homelessness crisis in California, in San Diego. And I met with the city council. It was a study visit, but unofficially they met with me. And I said, why don't you build some affordable housing here? Because there's clearly a shortage. They said, we can't. I said, why not? They said, it's because we don't have land. 70% of the homes in San Diego are zoned for single family use. We just don't have enough land under our control. And I said, who has land? They said, the federal government is sitting on all this land because they've got this naval base. I said, why didn't you negotiate then? Have your mayor talk to people. They said, well, why didn't you suggest to the mayor and seek a meeting with them? I said, well, I asked for a meeting, but the mayor refused to meet with me. So this is the way things are going in rich countries. But the way you see in developing countries is the opposite. There, the issue is not so much an inflated ideology of property, but an inflated ideology of sovereignty. So they believe that eminent domain, for example, as an exercise of sovereign power, is unlimited. It's the equivalent of, say, sovereign power of, say, the King of England in the 14th century, right? So they would just take anybody's land. Nobody else has any other rights. Sovereignty is this little, it's like a jewelry, that belongs only to one person and it can't be really shared with anybody else. Unfortunately, both these inflated ideologies have undermined the right to adequate housing, because they don't facilitate access to land. They lock up land, either in the market or in the hands of a narrow group of elites controlling the state. They then dish out land to their friends and cronies. This is what happens in many developing countries. And what I've argued in this report is we've got to really tone these two down, find ways of curbing these excesses. So I hope this report turns out to be useful also for advocacy and exploring new models. So in the city where I teach, for example, I've long been inspired by models like Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which didn't really look at, I think many of you will know, DSNI didn't really look at, for example, an alternative to property, but instead they looked at an alternative conception of sovereignty, because they looked to ways in which eminent domain can be devolved to the community level. There are hardly any real good, great examples. Why didn't DSNI become a scalable model, for example? Could it not have become? I often wondered about that. But I do think that there is a need to really take land very seriously. In a world where land prices are running free, without any controls, and as long as they remain out of control in the hands of only a few, most of us will have no access to secure housing. That's where we are. So let me just stop and thank you, Rob, again for this wonderful.
So very, very pertinent remarks from the Rapporteur. As an organizer, many of you have heard me preach about land. I know my students have, many of them here. Tom and I, from the day you came into our class, said this class is about land and changing our fundamental relationship to land. It has to be. And I often compare our Constitution, 250 years old, to the Brazilian Constitution written post-dictatorship in 1985 that says land has to serve a social purpose or function. What a fucking novel idea, man. Right? Fucking incredible, right? Thinking outside of the box, but it's more modern thinking. It's a little bit different. So, Mr. Rajagopal, we really appreciate those comments and really appreciate the work that you are doing. There are many treaty obligations, and the Rapporteur talked about, I talked a little bit earlier about treaty obligations and other mechanisms that many of us use to enforce human rights. And you're going to hear me use this term over and over. I'm not a human rights defender, I'm a human rights enforcer. I think they mean two different things. For me personally, it starts with the founding document of the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I often use Article number 25, which guarantees a lot of the things that we all are fighting for. So I would urge you to familiarize yourself with that particular document. There are also peer reviews like the Universal Periodic Review, which was scheduled to happen. The US was scheduled to be reviewed next month, early next month. It won't happen, folks. But I'm going to bring up to the stage somebody who is organizing around an event where the people are organizing themselves to have a similar event. So our next presentation by Cia Hedge will go into more detail by connecting the global to the local. Cia Hedge is a human rights lawyer based here in New York City, where she currently works with the National Homeless Law Center on advancing the right of housing and decriminalizing homelessness and poverty. She was previously a civil public defender at the Bronx Defender's Office, where she engaged in clients facing advocacy and litigation that centered on civil consequences of individuals' contact with the legal system. Let me just say that Cia and I met on a Zoom call with the Rapporteur in August of 2020 during the pandemic, when Mr. Rajagopal reached out to us and said, what can I do to support your work in communities around the world? And Cia was on the phone and heard me interacting with the Rapporteur and started chatting me up, and we became very close from that point on. So it's one of those moments I'll always remember. So I want to just say that as part of the National Task Force of Civil Society Advocates, she engaged with the UN human rights mechanisms in Geneva and around criminalization of homelessness and poverty, and also is a board member of the relaunched U.S. Human Rights Network. Folks, I'd like to bring up to the podium now my good friend, Ms. Cia Hedge.
So if you aren't too bored with all the UN trivia, and this is a little bit more, but it's relevant very much to the civil society grassroots lens that Mr. Rajagopal did such a lovely job explaining. So again, thank you so much, Professor Rajagopal, for being here and gracing us with your presence and your expertise. For Rob and others in this space who have joined us as we examine really under a critical and timely eye the human rights interventions around the criminalization of homelessness and poverty here in New York City, which we all, I think, can agree at this point is on a very global spotlight. So all the better to kind of have multiple brain trusts in the same room talking about this. So I just wanted to, before I turn the stage to the panelists, I wanted to ground us for a few minutes on the Special Rapporteur's comments in the context of national, state, and local advocacy to grow a people-centered human rights movement and amplify U.S. human rights violations to the United Nations. So as an overview, as Rob kind of mentioned, the Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR, established by the UN General Assembly in 2006, is a monitoring mechanism of the Human Rights Council. The mechanism involves a peer review of the human rights record of all 193 UN member states every 4.5 years. And up to date, there have been 3 completed cycles. This is kind of a timeline to, I'm sorry for all the text, but there's a timeline that shows every 4.5 years when the 3 cycles happened. And dating back to 2008, we've so far had 100% member state participation in each cycle. So that was the historic picture. The UPR's central purpose is to promote the universality, interdependence, indivisibility, and interrelatedness of all human rights, and to improve the human rights situation on the ground. It does this by serving as a cooperative mechanism based on objective and reliable findings, action-oriented processes, non-politicized and transparent systems of review, and are inclusive of all relevant stakeholders, including civil society. The UPR is a significant and unique innovation based on the principles of equal, non-discriminatory treatment for all countries. It provides an opportunity for all UN member states represented by their federal executive authorities to report on actions that are taken to improve the human rights situations in their countries and the challenges that they've faced. The UPR also facilitates sharing of best human rights practices around the globe. The outcome of that UPR includes observations and recommendations informed by a national government report submitted by the country that is slated for review, civil society stakeholder reports, and a compilation of information over the course of the 4.5-year cycle by special rapporteurs of particular thematic areas, other individual expert mechanisms appointed by the UN Office of the High Commissioner in Geneva, as well as other human rights treaty bodies. So a lot of different factual, holistic bits of information that go into this cycle. We are now in the 4th cycle, so the 2022 to 2027 cycle of the UPR. In an historic, unprecedented move, as Rob disclosed, in August of this year, the US federal government announced its refusal to participate, with the UPR scheduled for November 7th otherwise. Prior to this, the US failed to submit its national report outlining its human rights obligations, challenges, and progress to the Human Rights Council. On the contrary, over 150 civil society reports were submitted to the Council in April of 2025, highlighting pressing concerns around the acute domestic human rights crisis that we find ourselves in. This is a visual of the various key thematic issue areas of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights that civil society captured in these stakeholder reports. As you can see, their proximity to one another speaks to their interdependency and intersectionality. So housing, of course, is on here. Criminalization ties together a bucket of various thematic issues, but they sort of speak for themselves. And I can just send you the slides after. Lots of text on the slide, I'll go quick. Our UPR Coalition's working group on criminalization of poverty and homelessness had the pleasure of producing multiple reports for the Council's review. One of these that are pertinent to our discussion today was a subnational report that drew on a range of human rights violations across New York State. These findings implicated issues of housing insecurity, but also uplifted impacted voices and perspectives from the structural effects of racism and poverty, immigrant surveillance, mass incarceration, family policing, criminalization of LGBTQ+ communities and sex workers, the criminalization of survivors and persons with disabilities, youth and young persons experiencing homelessness, and tenants at risk of eviction. Across the city and state, we are witnessing an alarming expansion of the police state and erosion of rights through the criminalization of poverty. It was important for us to not only acknowledge the root causes that are responsible for these social ills, but also draw explicit connections to the human rights violations under international law. So as Professor Rajagopal remarked, the criminalization of homelessness is not only a violation of the right to adequate housing, but it also undercuts the rights to be free from arbitrary detention, use of excessive force, interference, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Also violating the right to life, the right to liberty and security, and a number of others. Altogether, these findings reflect a state and local government's retreat from the United States' human rights obligations and a profound erosion of New Yorkers' right to live in dignity and safety. And finally, our report concluded with proposed recommendations that capture 3 main buckets of human rights interventions in New York State and local leaders, for New York State and local leaders to adopt. They reflect the general recommendations that were issued against the United States and all levels of government by the UN Human Rights Committee in 2023 and the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination in 2022. Though they also uplift a more holistic, transformative set of policies to abolish the criminalization of homelessness and advance a culturally appropriate right to housing for all. Again, the buckets speak for themselves. It's very much along the theme of investing in universal, holistic human rights standards, divesting from criminal legal responses, and incorporating a lens that reflected the experiences and perspectives of those with lived expertise across the multiple intersectional parameters. So with that, I will now turn to our panel. I think we'll introduce again, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Sia. Obviously, there were some of us in this room that are very passionate about this work, and Sia is one of them. And for me, it's a lot of fun. As I do this work, when I first came to this work as a member of Picture the Homeless, I was told you can't work with the legal community and you can't work with academia. I make the argument today that I'm where I am because of those 2 different bodies, right? I'm obviously teaching in an academic institution, and I have surrounded myself with legal minds to help me think through a lot of the strategies. So I poo-pooed that whole idea. I want to move on to our panel and our roundtable discussion. And I'm going to first take a little time out to introduce the moderator, and the moderator will introduce the discussants. The moderator is somebody I've known for a number of years. I won't tell you how many because I don't want to embarrass her, but we've worked together for a number of years in a body called the Continuum of Care, which monitors money that comes in from HUD to New York City in the name of McKinney-Vento funding. You know, when I started in that body, we were receiving in New York about $100 million a year. It goes towards housing plus services. Today, it's somewhere around $180 million. So a bunch of us committed, much like the work of the Rapporteur. It was volunteer. Many folks working in that body, I served 13 years in that body, 12 of those as a steering committee member. I didn't receive a dime for the work, but it was because we cared about these issues in New York City and people like Jessica. So. She is somebody I call a confidant, a friend, and an advisor. As I said, we've known each other for a number of years. I won't go into the number of years because I don't want to embarrass Jessica. I am a little mad at her. I expected one of her daughters here tonight who was learning about human rights in school, and she couldn't make it work, but it's a pleasure for me to have her in the space anyway. So Jessica Katz is a strategic policy advisor at Cannon Heyman Weiss LLP, and a principal of Silver Bullet Consulting. She is the former Chief Housing Officer of New York City and was previously Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up tonight's moderator, Ms. Jessica Katz.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Rob, and many thanks to the Special Rapporteur for coming. I feel like we're getting this exciting sneak preview that the UN doesn't even get to hear about until tomorrow, so that's exciting. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and as I do that, before I want you guys to think through the first question that I'm going to ask, which is, a friend of mine used to start all of his panels with an exercise that he called Check Your Bias. So I want everyone to think about what perspective are you coming from, what are you carrying into this conversation that kind of forms your perspective, and I think we have a really wide range of places that we're coming from to this work, so that usually brings out the best kind of conversations. So I want to introduce the panelists. First, Leah Goodridge. is a nationally renowned lawyer, keynote speaker, and writer. This is the coolest thing I've seen in a bio in a long time. Goodridge was once highlighted in a sample sentence in the Merriam-Webster dictionary under the word litigator.
Under what?
Litigator.
How
That's
great.
really good. I want to be in the dictionary for one
That's
day. That's going to
cool.
be bucket list for me. She's also a former tenants' rights attorney, has been a member of the Rent Guidelines Board as well as the City Planning Commission, so thank you so much for all of that work as well. And has authored op-eds in major publications including the New York Times, Time Magazine, and Teen Vogue, which is another bucket list thing for me. I'm like checking things that I'm gotta add to my resume before this is all said and done. Thank you so much. Chris Quinn is the former Speaker of the New York City Council and served as and is president of WIN and CEO of WIN Women in Need since 2015. It's the largest provider of family shelter services in the city of New York, and made history as the first woman and the first openly gay Speaker of the New York City Council. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. Welcome. We also are lucky to have Fitzroy Christian here today, who's a member of the leadership team at CASA, which is Community Action for Safe Apartments. Good to see you all here. It's a membership-driven tenant and community organizing initiative out of New Settlement Apartments in the Southwest Bronx. So thank you so much for being here. He's a social justice advocate and activist who's led many campaigns across the city, up in Albany, and then around the world. So thank you for being here. So that's our panel today. So again, I want to start with this kind of check your bias exercise because I think a lot of us are coming here not from the human rights world per se, so I want to get a feel for where everyone's at. So for me, kind of bio-wise, I'm an urban planner. I'm currently studying emergency management because I'm worried and upset that we don't think about homelessness through an emergency management lens. I am a houser, so I have this hammer nail thing where I believe really deeply that homelessness is a housing issue because everywhere I go, I feel like I see that as the root cause of a lot of the other ancillary social problems that we're seeing around the world. And also primarily I'm a government person, so most of my career has been spent dealing with the kind of practical world as it is, incremental change, and kind of trying to battle through it that way. And I've rarely have I had positions in my career where I get to kind of think big picture about the world as it could be. I'm not by any means a human rights expert, but I am the product of the human rights community. I'm a Soviet refusenik, so I'm only alive today and only here today because of the human rights community and the human rights apparatus in the United States who helped bring my family over in the late 70s. So that's what I'm bringing in today. So Chris, over to you about your check your bias.
In some ways, similar to some parts of Jessica's story, I spent a long time working in or around. I spent a long time working in or around New York City government. So I definitely think. Usually I don't need a mic, but
No? Hello? Hello? Is it working? Hello?
I can just talk louder.
Okay.
And I spent a long time working in or around New York City Hall and City Council, so I also tend to think about what's doable and how do you get it done on the city or state level, which is sometimes a great perspective and sometimes narrowing, depending. So I don't also spend a lot of time thinking about the huge or biggest picture, but how do you get things done? And I also come from the lens now of running WIN, where we are focused exclusively on homeless families with children and have a particular interest in the children and how they kind of get left behind in all of the work that happens. And agree with Jessica, I come from a lens of, we need more housing to fix this problem, and that really impacts a lot of what I'm thinking about.
My bias is slightly different in that I grew up in the Caribbean. I'm from the Caribbean, and I grew up at a time where the trade unions were being formed and the political parties were being formed, and both of them together were in this battle for decolonialization, for independence of the Caribbean movement. I grew up, both my parents were activists in the independence movement. And I remember being taken to these meetings. Of course, I was too small to understand what is going on. But I kind of rebelled in these women pinching my cheeks. And I used to enjoy going to them, now realizing that I was being taught a whole lot of stuff, which led me to where I am today. But I am not a believer in incremental changes. I think it does not work, it never worked, and it will never work. If we're going to be making changes, it has to be wholesome and total and immediate. And that has been the level that, or the lens through which I've been seeing my work with CASA, and with the other organizations that I have been working with in coalition, with CASA and these other groups. I have never had the fortune of working with Ms. Quinn, though I've been to City Hall, and I kind of made my voices heard and made my intentions known quite a few times. But we're never coalition partners. Leah, I have worked with her, and C.E.O. quite a few times over the years, so they kind of were familiar with me. But I think I'm going to be bringing a different perspective from the panel this evening. And it's going to be very deliberate. So, sorry. And I should say too that Rob and I have been going back for quite a while, and I have learned so much from this guy. I'm sorry. Okay.
I'm Leah, and it feels kind of weird to say my bias, my lens. I grew up here in New York City in Brownsville, which is a very low-income and working-class community, and I lived there from a very small child until I went to college. And one of the things I got to learn about New York City that I think few people understand, at least in the 80s and 90s, is that it's incredibly segregated. So one is just experiencing what it's like to grow up in a working-class area of New York City that is very much still the same, like 30, 40 years later, revealing my age. And I would say another lens that I see through is I was a tenants' rights attorney working in various local nonprofits in New York City where I represented people who were facing eviction. And I'm not available, I don't answer any questions, but anyway, I did that work for 12 years. And a lot of the people that when you grow up in New York City and you're representing people who are literally from your community, you're literally representing people that you grew up with. So at least I would say like once every 3 months throughout like 12 years, I would bump into someone in housing court that I knew who was facing eviction. And so I became, like the work itself became very personal. And the other lens that I worked was being a member of the Rent Guidelines Board. There are different members, and I was the tenant representative appointed by I have to say appointed by de Blasio sometimes, because people are like, were you an Eric Adams appointee? But no, I was not. I'm sorry, no shade, but I'm behaving. Okay, fine, I'll behave. Is this live stream? I don't know. Okay. So appointed by de Blasio, where we got rent freezes. So, okay. So the work for me is very personal, and so those are my biases.
So I think one place I want to start is what would it take? Rob and I wrote an op-ed in 2021 together about housing as a human right, and the premise of the op-ed was what would it take to make that more than a bumper sticker in New York City? So some of the topics that we talked about in our article was universal Section 8, housing supply, removal of some of the administrative burdens that we put in all of these social safety net programs, and finally the kind of interplay or kind of conflict sometimes between democratic principles and human rights, right? The way I see kind of a human right and a civil rights construct is that's something that rises even above our democratic principles, right? We can't get into a room and decide, okay, we're all gonna vote and say, I don't wanna bake a cake for Rob's wedding. right? We don't get to do that because we've decided that there's some human rights and there's some civil rights and there's some, ways that we're going to behave amongst each other that is even more important than everyone voting and getting together. But in housing and kind of our land use policies, we do just that. We get together and say, you know what, I think that guy should stay homeless a little while longer because we all voted and we decided, nah, we think that building's too tall. So I think that's something that is currently the debate in the New York City Charter Commission. So that was one of the things that we wrote about well before that commission was enacted, but that was another one of the conversations, is the interplay between hyper-local democracy and the human right of housing. I'm gonna go back reverse order through the panel, so I'm not constantly going in the same direction. What do you think it would take here in New York City in particular, or in the US, to make housing as a human right more than a bumper sticker? I'll start with you.
I think that when people say the term affordable housing, there's just very different definitions. And so right now, the prevailing definition in New York City is the affordable housing policy is simply just to build more housing. It's not necessarily that the actual affordable units are affordable. So you have lots of affordable housing that's literally, the eligibility is 6-figure income, or it's like, and I'm giving actual, this is not like vibes, or this is literal data, like it's $3,000 for a studio in Brooklyn. This is a literal affordable housing. And for many people, that's fine because they're like, oh, well, the market will take care of that because the more we build years, this will go out. And I think that if we're really talking about a government response, private developers are going to say that about the market. That's their slogan. But for a city government response, what would it take would be literally digging in and looking at what affordability is and changing our definition of affordable housing, because it cannot be simply supply and demand and calling anybody who has any issues whatsoever with the fact that most of the affordable housing are studios and 1-bedrooms. We need more family sizes. We need more units that are deeply affordable. Calling all of these people NIMBY and saying that they're anti-housing is not a true affordable housing approach or policy. So I think that we need to redefine how we're defining affordable housing.
My take is that thanks, Rob. For us to even begin to approach a sensible solution to homelessness is for the federal government of the United States first to adopt Article 25 that Rob referred to and accept housing as a human right. When they do that and they adequately fund it, then we can begin to seek real solutions. Until that is done, we're just going to be spinning ourselves in circles as we are now. Let's assume for a moment that Washington decides that yes, we're going to do it. We're going to recognize housing as one of the rights that we recognize here in this nation. Then it remains then for us in our localities, in our cities, in our states, to begin to fight for an alternative view of what really is housing. And for me, we'll begin to look at what is happening in Vienna, where there's massive social housing and there's a negligible amount of homelessness. Right? That is an example that we need to look at. We need to open the doors for what we call a tenant option for purchasing apartments that are in bad repairs, or the landlords, the owners are trying to go to foreclosure, to give tenants the opportunities to buy those properties. And they will then become tenant-owned buildings where that is their permanent home. They're no longer going to be facing, what do I call it? Evictions, homelessness, or anything. So those two approaches to housing, I think, will eliminate a lot of our homelessness. And part of what I had prepared here today is to link homelessness to the American prison system, which needs a whole lot of bodies coming through that pipeline so that the American prison system, which has almost $100 billion revenue every year, and their demand for bodies. And the United States need to fill those prisons with bodies according to the contracts that they have. We then will realize that that can no longer work, and it will no longer work because tenants are no longer being evicted, so they're not going to be homeless. They're not going to be picked up on the streets and forced into the incarceration system, so that they're not going to be feeding that industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. So once we look at how we're going to permanently house the residents of the nations around the world, and we can focus here in the United States, when we permanently house our residents, then we are no longer evicting them. We are no longer selling them into slavery in the prison system where they're doing labor for almost nothing per day, just to make the industrial world, the industrial sector keep growing and blossoming to ginormous amounts. I don't know, but that's my view. That's where we got to go. Work to have the housing recognized as a human right. It's probably funded, probably staffed, and then that will give us organizers, activists, social justice warriors, the tools we need to end homelessness.
Well, one of the first things we need to do, in New York, but really anywhere nationally or any jurisdiction, is to recognize the connection between homelessness and housing, which seems obvious, but it is not actually, in fact, obvious all of the time in government or other large institutions. One example is in the city of New York, there are a whole slew, depending on how each mayor, they pick how many they want, but of deputy mayors. Never has the issue of homelessness and the issue of housing been under the same deputy mayor. Now, the deputy mayors, in some way, no offense to a mayor, really are kind of overseeing the agencies and running things. But if they're not under the same person, if they're siloed, you're not making that connection at all. And it's interesting, right now at WIN, we're working to build a large supportive housing project in the Bronx. And speaking of land, we were able to do that because the city sold us the land for $1. It was city-owned land, but we have to get on an HPD list to be that kind of a supportive housing developer. Well, like I sent off a, not snotty, but like, what's the problem email to HPD yesterday. No problem, just so-and-so has to review the paper, and all of that slows you down because there isn't that connection and there isn't necessarily the urgency about homeless housing within HPD because it's not really their mandate. So that's one thing we need to make the connection. Two, we need to have leaders commit to ending the homeless crisis. For far too long, we've had leaders committing to or actually managing the problem. And really, in my opinion, they're trying to manage it off the cover of the newspaper. And if you're managing something, your perspective is you're always going to have it, right? And that you can make it better just through management as opposed to your goal being to eradicate the problem, the solution therefore being housing. So we need to change those two perspectives. Three, we need to recognize that it is all part of one big system, right? So people are in shelter for a host of reasons. Maybe they're fleeing domestic violence, maybe, they've been evicted, etc. Well, what are the things connected to that? Did they get evicted because they were working 2 jobs, but none of them were living wage jobs? Did they get evicted because they didn't necessarily have the educational or training level they needed to get a living wage job? Well, if that's the case, why aren't we funding really comprehensive income building and job training programs in the shelter? In this city, we look at how many people are in shelter. How many people are in shelter are how many people are in shelter, right? And we need to respond to that. What we don't really track or hold government accountable to is how many people return to shelter. And to me, that's a more important number because that number is either a credit or an indictment of the system that we're running. So we need to change that and recognize we can end homelessness, and part of doing that is having the right level of services in the shelter system to help people so they don't return. We also need to recognize, this goes a little bit to what both of you have said, that we need a diversity of housing to really end the housing crisis in New York and other places, and make it so the idea of housing being a human right is really an actualized thing. So for example, I started kind of doing this work in, I said this recently and somebody looked at me like I was 100 years old, at the end of the Koch administration. And if you said in a group like this then, we need more affordable housing, people would think for homeless or very low income people. You say that now, and the truth is we need homeless housing, low income housing, moderate, and even middle income housing. That kind of fictitious couple everybody talks about who's a teacher and a firefighter. It's hard for them to find a place in New York City right now, to live. And the idea of home ownership, New York's really a renter town, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to also focus those resources on that. So we need to, make sure we're building and subsidizing housing at all those different levels, but also recognize that some folks need a little extra support to thrive independently. And that isn't just homeless folks, all kinds of folks. But if you have money, if you have health insurance, you can get that support, right? I've sometimes made the joke that, if you have a therapist, if you have a psychiatrist, if you have a nanny, you're living in supportive housing. You're just able to pay for it, right? So let's make sure that we have enough supportive housing for folks who can thrive independently with just a little bit more support. There isn't one singular answer, but if there's one singular goal, then we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Excuse me, Jessica, can I ask Christian just one question?
Yeah.
How would you go about ending the shelter system then, and maybe put these folks who we're going to be educating, who we're going to be training, into permanent homes rather than back into a shelter system?
So a couple of things. I'm going to speak from the families with children perspective. So it could be different, if you ask somebody who ran a system for singles. But what I would do, so the average length of stay for a family in shelter in the city of New York is 15 months. And when it happens to be 11.1 months. What I think a big thing that's lacking is what is, you could call, there probably is a better name for it, aftercare. Yeah. Why aren't we, and maybe you would start it from day one, maybe you would start it at 3 months, maybe you started at 6 months, why aren't we following up with people when they leave shelter to make sure that when they hit that hurdle of whether it's getting in the rhythm of paying bills every month, and people might have gone from their parents' home to living on a family member's floor into shelter. They may not have that experience. Or if you're a domestic violence survivor, often you're being battered in a financial way, right? And the batterer has taken out a whole bunch of credit cards in your name and you don't have any credit, right? And you need to have that figured out. We need to do that kind of follow-up. But I would argue, don't have WIN do it. Have the local neighborhood group where they're living do it. A group like WIN can train people how to do it, but then they have a connection to support and resources in the neighborhood. I think that would be one big thing that would reduce return to shelter. Two, I think if you had really good job training, we call it income building at WIN because a lot of our moms was like, I have a job, but I don't have enough money to pay the rent, I need more income. If you had real income building, so people left shelter with a job that could meet their 30% of income requirement for vouchers and rent, etc., that would reduce. Also in family shelters, if the city fully funded and kind of mandated more services for children in a trauma-informed way so they could process what they had been through, you're going to reduce the likelihood that that child is going to grow up to be a homeless adult, because having been a homeless child is a huge indicator for becoming a homeless adult. So those are 3 things.
Thank you.
I just want to provide some context. I just had to look it up, so it doesn't look like I'm on my phone. When I talk about the housing, I don't think most people know that when we say low income, in New York City, the actual eligibility for low income is $90,000. Like that is literally the eligibility. It goes up to $90,000. Can anyone in this room take a guess of, out of all of the completed housing projects, what percent was for extremely low income? Just throw out a number.
13.
15.
15.
15. So 85% of this housing is for really what is really considered moderate income, but it's termed low income. So when I'm talking about how I represented low income New Yorkers who were taxi drivers, home health aides, and they're facing eviction, most of my clients literally are not eligible to afford the housing being built. So for me, this is like a real problem that I think, this is what I just wanted to provide some context where I say because when I say this, sometimes people are like, what about the teachers? What about the firefighter? I get this all the time. And this isn't to say an either or, but this is to say, okay, but when we're talking about building low income affordable housing, no one who's low income can actually afford this housing. So we need to address that.
And interestingly, in the first housing plan of Mayor de Blasio, there were no units that were affordable no proposed units that were affordable to families exiting shelter. And we haven't seen any plan from Eric Adams either that has that. So that's really, notable. And one of the things about building affordable housing is you need to subsidize it, right? You need to subsidize it, and you need to make sure that those subsidies continue forever. Like Mitchell-Lama was a great program to develop middle-class housing, but the 30 years, it sounds great if you're an elected official signing this document for 30 years. When the hell is 30 years going to come? 30 years comes, and then people were really in a bad situation. And governments, your budget is the most important moral document of a government. It's what you're spending taxpayer money on. You subsidize the things you care about. When I was Speaker of the City Council, we would always, in the budget process, have the folks from the, boroughs aside from Manhattan would be like, we need money for tree pruning. Nobody in Manhattan really cared that much about tree pruning. It wasn't as a big thing, but the constituents in Queens cared about tree pruning. We funded tree pruning. It matters. If you care about having homeless people housed, you need to fund housing. But that doesn't always happen, and that connection isn't always made.
If I may, sorry. I know this, we kind of stuck here, but I guess we're going to be moving shortly anyway. But I have a problem, part of what you said now, Ms. Quinn, about subsidizing these folks who enter and sometimes re-enter the shelter system. It costs the city of New York almost 4 times as much to keep a person in the shelter system than to find a permanent home for them.
That's right.
So why are we still talking about subsidizing, instead of getting that money and working with community developers and building truly affordable housing for the people who need it? Those who are making $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 per year.
So I'm talking about subsidizing permanent housing. I'm talking about to build permanent housing, whether it's through a not-for-profit or a for-profit developer, right? Because look, when we're building a building in the Bronx, we're going to build another building in East Harlem. I'll never build as many buildings, right, as somebody who that's all they do for a living. So you need to have a diversity, in my opinion, of ways that you subsidize. So we're not really, whether it's nonprofits or tenant-owned or for-profit, putting enough money into that piece of it. Now the reality is, even if we said today, we're going to create enough housing to house all of the homeless families in shelter, it's going to take a period of time to build that, right? And people need to therefore be somewhere. So let's make that somewhere the most effective it can be. But the majority of the money should go into building and running that housing, the permanent housing. But let's make the shelter time more than just, you know, as my late father would have said, more than 3 hots and a cot, right? Let's make it something that really is going to work for folks.
So I'm going to keep us stuck here too, so don't worry. I'm going to keep us stuck here too for a minute, and just to put a couple of kind of specific policy notes on some of these themes. One is in terms of prevention. I think one of the reasons why we're really struggle with homelessness prevention in New York City is that we have horrible data. We really don't know of the several million people, you know, many of whom have organized with you and stayed in your shelters and been your clients. There's several million people in New York City who I don't know why they're not homeless. It's a miracle that they're not homeless given some of the rent burdens and some of the situations that they're in and the lack of housing that we have here in the city. So the number of people who are getting under that red line there's a huge number, and we really struggle. We don't have there's never been good data on which of those people end up actually in the shelter system, and so then we end up having to have a very thin, flimsy program for a ton of people with a little bit of help because we don't know how to target it. One of the few things that we do know is, as Chris said, that if you have a childhood history of homelessness, you're much more likely in the following generation to become homeless as an adult. So that is actually one of the few indicators that we know that is a huge driver, that is something that we really need to worry about. I also want to point out on the other side of that affordability equation, there's the income question, and then there's the percent of your rent question. So affordability typically in the United States is defined on the housing side, is defined as if I'm not paying more than 30% of my income towards rent, that means I'm affordably housed. So if I'm paying 29% of my income, that's affordable to me. If I'm paying 31% of my income, now that's a rent, now we call that rent burdened, and if you're paying more than half of your income, we call that severely rent burdened. But so that 30% number we use across the board, and we kind of assume that because it's a flat number, that kind of has an equal impact on everybody. But if you earn $100,000 a year, you're 30%, and you're spending 30% of your income on rent, you know, you can go to brunch afterwards. But if you're making $40,000 a year and you're spending 30% of your income on rent, it sounds the same, but you can't buy a quart of milk by the time your landlord's been paid and the lights stay on. So that 30% number is sort of this, you know, we in the affordable housing world, we feel very comfortable with that number because it feels fair and equal, and it's one straight line across the page, but it actually has very different impacts on families. And it's by gross, it's not after taxes. So, you know, so that's something that when I was at CHBC, I wrote a feminist housing plan, and we found that 30% number has a really bad disproportionate income on female-headed households. Because if you're earning $50,000 and you're a household of 2 working adults and 1 child, that's a very different picture in terms of your income and your costs and your housing needs than if you're a single parent with 2 kids, which is almost always a female-headed household. So it's kind of this, it's misogynistic on top of everything else, on top of not being equal, but it's something that we really, we rest, it's like the bedrock of the whole system that we really struggle to feel otherwise.
Yeah, no, I was talking to a reporter today about supportive housing, and a lot of tenants in supportive housing, including the supportive housing that Wynn runs, fall into rent arrears. It's almost like a given in the supportive housing world, and you work with them to get one-shots and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I realized when I was talking to the reporter, I was kind of sanguine about it. Well, like, yeah, right, supportive housing tenants are in arrears. And then in the course of the conversation, I said, you know, we really should look at the model, because if we're saying supportive housing tenants have to pay X amount in, and everywhere in everybody who's running it, they can't do that, and groups like Wynn lose money on supportive housing, which means at some point groups are gonna, we're able to raise private money, not everybody is able to do that. So, and she said, well, you're actually saying we should change the numbers? And I said, well, I'm saying we should look at it, and probably that is true. Because right, there was a time when it was 25%. And then I think in the late 80s, HUD raised it to 30%. That was a very disruptive change.
Can I just add a piece to this conversation? I want to, and forgive me for taking a little bit of privilege, but something that Christine brought up I think is important, right? Bringing some type of living wage job training. I've always argued that the city has to negotiate with the building trades unions, right? Electricians, carpenters, plumbers, right? If you're an apprentice as a plumber, you're going to make a living wage. Just an apprentice as at the very beginning. So why can't the city negotiate that 10% of these positions are held for formerly homeless people? Sometimes institute that. Something Jessica said about data, and there's a disconnect within New York City with the continuum of care and how other homeless services are delivered. So the homeless management information system is capturing a lot of the data that Jessica is talking about. But in New York City, we have about 5 other systems that feed most of the data to, and it doesn't talk to this HMIS system. And that's a big part of the disconnect. So we're never going to get good data until those systems are talking and interacting with one another. So we found out in the continuum of care that we did have high rates of recidivism. And then we can hone in on how do we fix this problem, because we had the good data in the continuum of care. So I just wanted to add those pieces.
Thanks, Rob. I want to ask you all about the impact of the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision. I have started last night teaching a class at Columbia, and we talk a little, Rob's going to come speak at my class and talk about housing as a human right there. And, as we kind of started at the beginning, institutionally in the US, we still think of human rights as a thing that happens over there. Like, we tell other people what human rights are about. We are the purveyors of human rights around the world. I wish that didn't sound sarcastic. My family came here from the Soviet Union, and we very much believe that to be the case, and I want that to be the case every single day. I think in the homelessness world, though, the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision kind of, if we had that illusion, it was very shattered, and I want to hear from the panel about how that Grants Pass decision is going to impact New Yorkers.
I'm going to throw that to the lawyer.
I think that whoever the mayor is, it will have a huge impact locally. I say that because, my personal opinion on this is that throughout the last couple of years, we've seen an uptick in the demonization of unhoused people. Yes, there have been very public crimes on the front pages of newspapers where the person committing the crime has been unhoused, and so there's in the subway and other places, and so that has contributed to this uptick. But there's also just like let's just call it what it is. I feel like from this administration been like a real uptick, like I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't get to why I'm uneasy about this, is when I tell people I used to be on the rent guidelines board, the first thing they say is, oh, so you increased my rent. And I'm like, oh, no, I wasn't on that. I was, I have to clarify and go, oh, no, I wasn't part of that. I was before, right? So this is just another part of like, you're causing me to almost face homelessness. But in terms of the impact of Grants Pass locally, I think, we've seen an uptick of, this conversation of involuntary admittance and hospitalization, this sort of characterization of the fact that all homeless people have mental health issues, and so that's why they need to be admitted to hospitals without their, or just put in there involuntarily. And just a huge annoyance, and I talk about this often, but that did not start under the Adams administration. This goes back to centuries. One of the very first laws were part of the ugly laws. In 1867, San Francisco had a law. It was literally called the Unsightly Beggar Ordinance, where it was unlawful for a homeless person to be in public. And if they were, they would be arrested and taken away. So the criminalization part didn't start under the Adams administration, but there has been a lot more, in my personal opinion, again, comfort. And let's just call it out. It's not just New York, it's San Francisco. And perhaps that's easier with the black face, because 40% of homeless people in the country are black, and 56 in New York City are black. And so that would probably be much harder to do if you are the mayor and criminalize these folks if you're not. And so when you are able to openly say, we should, this person, all of these people are mentally ill, let's put them away, they need to be arrested, who's going to be able to actually say that with less consequences? So I also think we need to address I got real quiet, but I think we need to also address the elephant in the room. As you can tell, I'm a little bit of a rabble-rouser. I speak what I want. I said I would. Never ran, never will, oh well. That's a slogan from Brownsville, oh well. So, I think that, the impact, that's why I say it will have a huge, the biggest impact will be who is the mayor and what the tone that they set. Because you can have a tone, for example, that says, okay, we have a huge homelessness problem. We need to have more mental health services. We need to have more treatment. But when you have, I'm a lover of cops, and actually cops are going to be the main person that they're going to see. You're going to call 911 for a cop, and you have this whole why would you call a social worker? That's silly. When you have that mantra and that sentiment, that spills over into these people don't need help, they need to be criminalized. So, you can have an example would be, you can have a mayor who says, we need more shelters. We need more adequate shelters that are in different neighborhoods, for example, and not just, this is another thing, not just stuck in black neighborhoods. That's another thing. We need, so you've had some of that, we had, I don't want to talk for too long, but, there was a fairly recent fight, and tell me if I'm talking too long. Am I? Okay, there was a fairly recent fight in South Brooklyn where, again, you have homeless shelters, and you have, some elected officials and local residents who were like, we don't want a homeless shelter here. Why are you bringing a homeless shelter? We don't want a homeless shelter. And I will say that, Mayor Adams was like, okay, y'all need to stop. You're going to get a homeless shelter. That's it. But we also, apart from that, we need not just homeless shelters. That's the intermediate solution. We need a real commitment to housing for extremely low income, not just this whole build more housing and that will, because that's also saying we don't really care that much about homeless people. That's another form of saying we don't really care that much about homeless people. There's going to be housing for 90,000 people who make $90,000. We don't care, because you have to make a real commitment to where would these people go.
And let me just add one thing, look, there are housed people and unhoused people who need help in an inpatient psychiatric way. And the reality is we don't have enough of those places. I can't tell you how frequently I get an incident report, right, of something that happened at the shelter, and it's, so-and-so, a child or an adult had suicidal ideations. EMS came, they went to the hospital, you get another report, 6 hours later, they're back from the hospital, right, all of the time. Now, that's an issue where really, Andrew Cuomo is most to blame for having cut funding for inpatient beds, but a mayor appoints, I don't know what the title is, maybe it's executive director, maybe it's president, of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, right, which is the largest public hospital system in the country, and that can be a place where also mental health services, both inpatient and outpatient, for those who need it and want to go into it, should be prioritized, and we've never really seen that level of prioritizing around mental health services. So that's just another piece of this. Not that anybody should be forced, because if you force somebody into psychiatric care, it doesn't work. but those who need it and want it, which we often see with our moms. They want that help, but it isn't there for them. And you also can, it's about the tone too, because you can rest assured when they show up in the emergency room, nobody's like, oh great, the suicidal homeless mom is here, just who doesn't have insurance, just who we're looking for.
I think that's one of the most ironic things about this discussion around involuntary commitment is that there's not enough beds for people who desperately want to a place to stay in a hospital and who really need and actively, voluntarily want the services. So it's just funny that where we started is around involuntary commitment when there's tons of people who really do need and want that help that we don't have a place to put them anyway, so why would we start with the involuntary?
Right, so one of the issues that's popped up in the last couple of years, at least in my work, like having been in housing, is now that the homelessness conversation has now become in one with the migrant crisis. And so when it's being spoken about by the administration, now you have like people who I would have never thought, in even like the tenant advocacy space or in general, just are like talking about like, oh, I couldn't get like I've heard this like so many times at this point. Oh, I'm applying for affordable housing, or I'd like affordable housing, and New York isn't taking care of me, but they'll put a migrant in a hotel. Look what New York City is doing. This is not, and I genuinely think that a lot of this sentiment is coming from the top down. Like people are feeling like the housing crisis is now is being blamed on migrants, and that's in large part because now we've been having this largely like local conversation about there not being enough homeless shelters because of more migrants who at the start of it were bused from Texas and all of these different places. So that's just like another aspect of this, but that's why I say again, like some of this is like the tone, how it's being spoken about, and then it's also allowing, what I would have thought was like a very liberal city, like people are, I'm gonna be honest with you, I had a feeling that the national election was not going to go how we thought. Like the reason why is just in terms of talking about homelessness policy, I began to see people who I thought were very liberal. They started saying a lot of these like anti-immigrant things in New York City. And so I was sort of like, what is this? And I thought to myself, like, well, New York City seems like it's changing. And if New York City is changing, what the hell is happening on the national level? And so for me, I feel like, I don't know if you all have felt it, but I felt it, I've heard it, I've seen it. And so I think like even just homelessness policy, a lot of it starts with how we're thinking about the most vulnerable people and how others are talking about those people in blue spaces.
What I want to add to that is that the organizing communities in New York did not adequately respond to those messages that are coming down from Washington and from Albany, right? Is that we focus almost exclusively on our quote-unquote housing issues, and we did not go and say, hey, look, you are the child of an immigrant. You are the grandchild of an immigrant. What happened then is the same thing as what happened now. There are a bunch of people, sectors of your community, your grandparents or your great-grandparents' communities, that objected for the services that they were getting. So how can you now reasonably object to another group several generations later getting the same attention from their host country that my great-grandfather got 60, 70 years ago? You see, we did not respond to these things, and so we let them then, they festered. And now, one thing I didn't say is that I also worked with Brooklyn Legal Services as a paralegal. So I've had some of the experiences that Leah referred to, not to the extent that she has, of course, but I've seen some of it. And where I have had neighbors that I'm working in both buildings, organizing tenants. Those folks were once relatively close. They weren't exchanging Christmas presents, but they greeted each other, they recognized each other in the streets. They're no longer talking to each other. So how can we change anything in our communities when both sets of the folks who are being affected by it are not working together because I was born here or I was born and came in here at 8 years old? Makes a big difference, but we are both suffering the same things in our apartments which are touching each other.
So you're seeing the anti-immigrant too?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of it up in the Bronx.
I
So these are the things, I'm finishing in a second, that I think we need to look at, that we need to look outside of the boxes that we have framed ourselves in, right? I'm in housing, I'm in immigration, I'm in DV, I'm in this. There's a lot of interconnections, and we need to be in those spaces where they interconnect, because what is affecting you over here is affecting me over here. When my child, who goes to the same school as that immigrant child, and they speak and the accent is almost the same, they're both going to be treated the same. They're both going to be looked at other or different, and they're not going to be getting the services that they may need. So if they're together here, why should we be separate up here fighting against each other when we need to come together to address that issue and our housing issues? And the lack of lighting, proper lighting, the lack of proper sanitation, the rats that are running all over the cities, all over our streets. We need to stop looking at the small things that makes us different and focus on what things that we are together suffering from, that we need to work on together so that we can resolve those issues.
Thank you. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, so I want to hear if you all have questions, and if not, then I got one. Special Rapporteur gets the first question.
Yeah, so we're gonna do this in a little bit of a process. We have a limited amount of time, so I'm gonna focus on 3 questions. Gabriella, my department chair, is walking around with the mic, so we're gonna ask you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Gabriella will acknowledge you. We'll take 3 questions, and then we'll get responses and see what amount of time is left. We have to get out of this room by 6:30.
Hi, so kind of 2 things that are related is that no one here, I think, even said the word landlord. Like when you get evicted by a landlord. And so can you talk to, like, what can we do to also rein in landlords, because they set rent prices that price people out, and people are homeless not always because of an addiction, or sometimes it's just you've been displaced, and that is a form of homelessness, of like, I can't live on my own anymore and I have to like move in with my parents. And then 2, like, yes, supportive housing sounds great, but also how are we gonna fund that? Like NYCHA, it's been very publicly reported that NYCHA is underfunded, and literally, like, the city can't even house its literal current tenants. So how would we have affordable housing subsidized?
So just, I'm sorry, on NYCHA is not supportive housing, and that whole NYCHA is a whole nother conversation, right? We could have a whole
I'll be back for that panel.
on that.
No, I know, but I'm saying, like, that is still subsidized housing.
Sure, I mean, look, we have to prioritize it, right? You have to say that X part of the budget is going to go for that, because otherwise, look, to stay in a permanent apartment with a voucher, which is another form of subsidy, as an example, for a family of 4 costs $72 a night. To stay in a wind shelter for a family of 4 for one night is close to $300. And to stay in a welfare hotel where you get even less services, or almost no services, it's more than wind closer of $400 a night. So we're spending the money, we're just spending it incorrectly. On the eviction issue, the best thing the city can do, and this is a money thing too, is the city council a number of years ago mandated the right to counsel in housing court. Like, you get a lawyer if you can't afford it if you've been arrested. In housing court, you get a lawyer if you can't afford it. Very few tenants go to housing court with a lawyer, though 89% of landlords go to housing court
95.
with a 95. Oh, it's 95. Okay, 95% go with a lawyer. If the city, but right now there's like a waiting list to get that lawyer because there's such a demand, so the city needs to fully fund the program and raise the income level of who can qualify for those free housing lawyers, and you will see evictions plummet.
So
I
let
may-
me, oh, sorry.
No, okay. To answer your question about landlords, I try specifically not to use that word because they are part of a system, right? And even if you look at them as landlords, they go away, the system remains, and the same thing is going to happen, sometimes the same way or slightly differently. So we have to look at changing the system where we have landlords and tenants, where we have tenants who are owners of the space where they live, right? So I believe that if we continue to think and work, do our work as fighting landlords, we're going to be losing the battle because the landlords are just a part of the larger system, and it's that system that has to be changed, right? So yes, you would never hear me say that except it has to be said in that specific situation. It is always the system that you're fighting against and the system that you want to change to make the changes you want. I mean, that is my view of it.
Okay, so I will talk about fighting landlords all day.
We don't have a lot of time, Leah.
Okay, all right, I'm sorry. So one of the, yes, having tenants' rights attorneys, fine. I was one of the attorneys you mentioned. But one of the pitfalls is that the work is defensive, meaning defense work. So you're just responding to evictions, but it doesn't mean that you're filing these large scale impact litigation cases that really, in fact, because let me put this into perspective. These organizations are so overwhelmed that there are fights within the organization about how many cases someone can take. And when I explain this to tenants, they're like, lawyers, go and do your job. But it's like do you want an ER doctor to be like overwhelmed with too many patients? You literally can't do, it's so many people getting evicted, you can't do the work. So yes, we need more funding of these organizations, but that's one part of it. Another part is addressing more impact litigation and affirmatively suing landlords. And then there's a third part of it, which may have nothing to do with lawyers and more on the ground and organizing, which is education. And let me put this, I don't know if I can explain this well because I have been, but I'll try very quickly because I've been trying to put a name to this. But a phenomenon, I guess I would say, is there is a lot of respectability around this work. So there's a lot of people who were like, why are you fighting for tenants' rights? People should be homeowners. There's a lot of like, if you're past a certain age, there's a lot of like, why are you even still a tenant? Like if you're 50 and facing eviction, there's a lot of people who are like, okay, but why didn't you buy a house? There's a lot of that. And so when you devote money and time and you ask for money and time to fight, I'm just gonna be blunt, they think this is some like white hippie artsy thing. And they don't realize people are very like, well, why wouldn't you fight for homeowner rights? And even when I've had 2 rent stabilized tenants in the last month actually say to me, to my face, I don't know about Zoran's thing about a rent freeze because what about the small landlords? This is, I'm telling you, there's a lot of, some of this propaganda, landlord-ganda, has really seeped in to the point of where in 2020, when we had the first start of the pandemic, a lot of tenants themselves were like, but I feel bad. There are a lot of scammers, like, what about the landlords? Like, what about, small landlords do not represent the majority of landlords. So the reason why I say we need like this large scale education is because for me, even I talk to like thousands of people, like I talk to so many tenants, and I can tell you, and maybe Fitzroy too, it's just a lot of people that even you have to move them, they think that this work should be just for us, a select class or temporary. Like they think the larger goal is, why don't you help people get a home, and that this is just some kind of like small project. So there's that part as well. If you want to talk about gathering people to like be against landlords, there's a lot of people who, even though they're tenants, they secretly like support them or think that that's the goal. If you go on if you see any urban podcasts, look, I don't want to call anybody out, but just think of any part, they're bringing on, oh, I was a real estate person. Look at how good, the whole mindset is like, how can you get money? The quickest way to get wealth is what? Real estate. They're talking about being a landlord. So there's a lot of like identification with one side and demonizing the other. So yeah, there needs to be a lot of education.
So the education has to happen through the social justice organizations in the city. And Rob Robinson is standing here and saying they are failing at that job. And you can quote me on that. Gabriella, we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll end, because I want to end with a message from Jamil Dakwa from the ACL.
So I want to give, I mean, the thing is that we have some hands, but I just want to give also a word to the students. So I'm going to start from here. Maybe we can take one more.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Charisma White. I don't know any of y'all, but y'all probably know me.
You don't know me?
Yes, I do. I work in the advocacy world of housing and homelessness, and I have a big mouth. Only truth stands in the space of change, and I'm the one with the boots on the ground and the foot on the neck until we get housed. So I wanted to ask, there is many buildings already available, put up all around my city where I was born, raised, my mother was born and raised, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, all born and raised in Brooklyn.
Give me a question, Charisma.
I want to know, why don't they just tell people they have to give up the apartments and the buildings where we do want to move into? All the Brooklyns, downtown Brooklyn, I've looked in them, I've had to bully to even get a viewing through CCHR.
But where are these people gonna go?
No, she's
And
saying
the buildings
empty.
No,
that are,
let me explain what charisma is.
She's talking about warehousing.
and the
Yeah.
buildings that are already put up half
No, she
empty,
got it.
so-called luxury. It's not a luxury to have a wash machine, a dishwasher, a closet in each bedroom that you are calling a closet. I mean, a bedroom. If you call it a bedroom, I should have somewhere to store my clothes. I should have a kitchen where you have a table. You could put a table, not a half a spaces kitchen, a half a spaces living room, where you can't even have company. I live in a
Sort of warehouse.
Well, can I just? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we want
sorry.
to take the final questions. We're supposed to
Okay,
vacate
all
this room
right.
at 6:30.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was asking, why can't we move into the buildings that are already being built in our community?
Organizing.
Okay,
What-
take the rest of, now we have to take the rest of the questions.
System was
Okay, it's good enough because we need.
Here, can you speak it out because and then we have that lady over there.
My question was kind of related to what you were saying, Fitzroy, about how incremental change can be challenging. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Becca. Continue.
Incremental change can be, and sometimes ineffective for like the ultimate goals. And so I appreciated what all of you were talking about teaching people in the shelters these strategies for being able to then have permanent housing and to keep that permanent housing. And I'm just wondering, like, this system is working as it was built. Like, this system was built on slavery, and the point of it is to keep some people low income, and so they're trying to make the wealth gap bigger. And so my question is, like, yes, we can give people those strategies, but how do you try to change this? How do you try to create a new system that is not built upon these problems that we knew existed from the beginning of when they made it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Makes total sense.
Do you want to
Well, I
get the
think we're gonna
other
get the
answer
third
Yeah, we
question
want
first?
the final question and
Okay.
then.
Yeah, I'd like to know human resources administration. When a person like me, I went to apply for the one-shot deal for the first time. I'm a social worker by profession. When I went there, they told me, yes, oh yes, you qualify, you approve. where I had to go there like 5 or 6 times in order to be approved, because there was something wrong with that. In the meantime, I was being rushed by my employer. I'm a city worker, and I was almost at the brink of losing my job. So you know what happened? They approved me. Finally, they approved me after what, several months. So when that happened, I didn't know it was a loan. So if I'm coming because I need money, and then you're telling me that I have to repay that money back, what's going to happen with my income? Okay, it's going to decrease a lot more than it was before. So you, instead of you helping me, you're bringing me down. So, and not only that, instead of that, I would have preferred for them to educate me. Tell me, listen, for this not to happen, you know what we can do for you? We can send you to school for finance. Maybe you mismanagement your money, okay? Like they do with criminals. They send you to parole every so often to educate you so you can do the right thing. Why are we not educated? If I don't have the knowledge that I could be educated about finance, I could be educated about not to, how to manage my money and pay my rent on time, how to take care of my children. My children were in college, and now they had to leave college because I didn't have the money to pay for that. Now they were putting me into CUNY Care. You know what CUNY Care does? CUNY Care have them apply for public assistance, Medicaid, cash and food stamps. I'm not sending my kids, I'm not paying my kids to go to college to learn those things. You're driving them for the system to sustain them.
So let me just jump in here, because we understand where you're getting at, and we've all identified that the system is a problem. Fitzroy has said to you repeatedly, we need to change the system.
Right.
And in my opinion, and this is Rod Robinson speaking, we need a disruption, right? So that the country, we as people need to rise up and force the change. And sometimes that means going to the streets.
Prevention
right?
program, that's all we need. It's very simple.
Prevention programs is not going to change the system.
I mean, the short-term goal, it will. Short-term goal.
So I'm going to invite Jamil Dakbar from the ACLU's Human Rights Program to sort of close us out. While he's making his way up here, I want to thank my student Zane, who I asked to film this event yesterday in class. And Zane is sitting here filming this. So I want James to get a big hand.
And I think you should get extra credit, I'm just saying.
The one thing Rob does is appreciates his students, and most of my students from my current class are sitting in here. And I hope y'all appreciate being here and the messages that you're receiving today. And, you know, they have the Rapporteur reinforce the message that I delivered you on the first day. Our struggle is one for land. Makes me feel real good. I'm going like this.
Is it going to be internet, video?
I'm sorry?
Are you going to upload?
Okay, have a seat and we'll explain how we're going to close out here. Okay, please don't touch the switches.
No, I can do it from here.
No, Jamil, come on. Come on up.
It's okay, I can do it from here.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Jamil Dakbar from the ACLU, and I want to thank the panelists and, of course, the Special Rapporteur for being here, and for the organizers, Sia and Rob. Thank you so much for making it happen. What I wanted to say is, this is all really have to put it in the context of where we are right now as a country, as a world. There's a serious human rights crisis that are happening. What we are doing here, what you are all doing here, embracing these rights-based approaches are one of the best chances that we can win. And we can come out of this crisis, whether it's national, global, and local here, by really recognizing that every single one of us have those rights and we can fight for them. So I wanted just to say that this is not, you know, when we are talking about the overall crisis in the human rights movement, the only way that we are now going to be able to save the country is by these local and state fights against what is happening. Because we see the attack on every single aspect of democratic accountability happening, and not anymore the words that can express the gravity of the situation. But that means that we need to double down our efforts as civil society organizations, the partnerships that we do, and working sometimes very closely with state and local officials that are on our side. It's great to see former Speaker Gwen and the work that she's doing, and having her part of that, and seeing how that experience is bringing back to the work that's need to be done. I just wanted to say one thing to close with, because there is something that I, at least personally, was able to work on the local level here and state level. As a member of the New York State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we worked on a report that looked at racial discrimination and eviction practices and enforcement in New York State during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. And in the report, one of the first recommendations that we made was to shift the paradigm around housing to view it as a public good and basic human need and recognize housing as a human right. The other one, that went to the Congress and to the presidency in 2022, which they heeded that. But in the state of New York, what we said, particularly to the state of New York, amend the New York State Constitution to recognize and protect the right to housing as a constitutional right and implement it in line with international human rights norms and U.S. treaty obligations, including in the context of evictions. So there are things that have, that we can push for them to be part of our legal system. And just like we did an amendment to this New York Constitution on environmental health, healthy environment, which is now something that could lead to others. So I really want us to all continue to do those kinds of engagement from the global, from the UN Special Rapporteur mandate to the very local. This is the really only chance that we were able to really bridge those gaps and fight back while proactively think about where can we make a difference in the lives of so many people who are impacted for so many years, and now we are in a much, much urgent and acute time. So thank you for being here, and thank you again for everyone who spoke here.
Thank you, Jimmy.